Hey, welcome to the third of my five-part series on World War II. We've covered how the ball got rolling in Europe through the rise of the fascists, and we saw how Japan's Imperial Army began an aggressive and brutal expansionist movement in Asia, all before trying to secretly take out the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Now we're going to rewind about a year here to the point in December of 1940 when FDR's destroyer for bases deal with Britain's Churchill angered the isolationists in America. FDR had traded 50 naval warships to Britain in exchange for access to naval bases in Bermuda and other British colonial holdings. The president, soon after taking this criticism, gave a fireside chat to radio listeners. Almost 40 million Americans listened, and he told them that there is a real threat to national security, the threat of the expansion of fascism, and that the United States had a unique opportunity to become the great arsenal of democracy. In other words, the supplier of all war goods, all munitions to all democracies who are fighting against tyranny and oppression of Nazi Germany, Italy, and Imperial Japan.
We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself. We must apply ourselves to our task with the same resolution, the same sense of urgency, the same spirit of patriotism and sacrifice as we would show were we at war. We have furnished the British great material support, and we will furnish far more in the future. There will be no bottlenecks in our determination.
Along with mobilizing the economy to prepare for war, long before entering, Congress held the first peacetime draft in our nation's history, the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940. All males ages 21 to 36 had to register for service, and immediately the nation would start selecting young men for military training. The 1940 conscription bill was set up this way. All dates from the year, 365 of them, would be put in one drum. In another drum would be the numbers 1 to 365. Every birth date that was picked up would be assigned a number. For example, August 4th might get the number 2. The lowest numbers were the people who would be chosen first. They also would pick a particular year that they would start with. At that time, it was those who had turned 21. In other words, those who had been born in 1919. Upon receiving an induction notice, starting with perhaps August 9th, 1929 birth date, men would have to go to the Regional Military Entrance Processing Station for physical, mental, and moral evaluation. If the man was notified that he was fit for service, he had 10 days to file for exemption. Otherwise, it was off to boot camp and 1 year of service in the U.S. Army. The draft bill wasn't extremely popular, but on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, feelings of patriotism and support for the war became widespread. Tens of thousands of young men volunteered to join the U.S. military, and this delayed the need for the government to draft more citizens, but not for long. 50 million men were required to register between 1940 and 1945, with over 10 million drafted and trained. When combined with volunteers, nearly 16 million Americans served in World War II. And for one of the first times in U.S. history, non-whites were placed in important combat roles, including 300,000 Mexican Americans, over 1 million African Americans, and 25,000 Native American soldiers. In the war in the Pacific, each U.S. Marine division was home to at least one native Navajo language speaker. These 375 Navajo Indians were the code talkers for Marine Radio Command. The code was very simple. For the most part, Marines just gave orders in the Navajo language, but some military words had no Navajo equivalent, so a substitute was needed. For tanks, the code talkers used the word for turtle. The Navajo word for potato meant hand grenade. With fewer than 30 non-Indian Navajo speakers in the entire world in 1940, the code was never broken by the Japanese, and of the 375 Marine code talkers, only 10 were killed in battle. Before the war, another milestone occurred as black soldiers were not only allowed to serve in combat, but were finally integrated into some white combat units within the U.S. Army in Europe, although total desegregation of all U.S. armed forces was not complete until 1948. The millions drafted in the first 2 years went to Miami for boot camp, which doesn't sound too bad. It mirrored the expected invasion point into Europe, Italy. And while boot camp is notoriously difficult, draftees were actually housed in beachfront hotels, including the Ritz-Carlton. Women served in the military too, in non-combat roles. They served as clerks, typists, airfield control tower operators, mechanics, photographers, and drivers. And those with flying skills could serve in the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, or the WASPs. They ferried airplanes from factories to airfields, and on base they would fly, dragging huge targets for anti-aircraft gun training, freeing up male pilots for combat flights. These female pilots became extraordinarily popular. So popular, in fact, that the mascot of the WASPs, Fifinella, was designed and drawn by Walt Disney and sewn onto the shoulder of their U.S. Army Air Force uniforms. After war was declared, FDR put in place the War Production Board to halt the production of civilian goods that used important resources and direct those companies' conversion to making things needed for war: planes, tanks, parachutes, guns, ammo, and surgical tools. And American companies were inclined and motivated to participate in the program, not just because of pride and patriotism, but because FDR established a cost-plus system which guaranteed if they filled military contracts, they would see corporate profits. And war production did shoot up. 300,000 airplanes, 80,000 marine landing crafts, 100,000 armored cars and tanks, let alone 6 million guns and 41 billion rounds of ammunition, enough to shoot every single person on Earth at least 20 times. In order to produce that volume of goods, a lot of people had to go to work, and the Depression was pretty much done. Unemployment went down, and wages rose nearly 50% from 1940 to 1945. Now, surprising to many patriots was the frequency of labor disputes during the war. For example, coal miners went on strike in 1943 because as both profits and wages were climbing for average Americans, so was the cost of living, and coal miners hadn't seen a wage increase since 1938. Along with wages and the standard of living going up, so did the cost of war. World War II would be 10 times more expensive for the U.S. government than World War I. Money would have to be raised by increasing taxes. War bond sales brought in $186 billion, and the U.S. had to borrow, not only from its citizens, but from banks as well. As unemployment vanished and wages rose, the American people had more extra money in their pockets for the first time in decades, but they had nothing to spend it on. Familiar consumer goods were suddenly unavailable. Product shortages due to rationing limited what consumers had access to. This will lead to the 50s being a time when American families have money and have savings, so prepare to return to a booming consumer economy. The government proposed conservation, and unlike World War I, enforced rationing. This had many effects, like a 35-mile-per-hour recommended speed limit nationally, and women's fashion changing, as skirts and dresses got shorter to save fabric, and swimsuits began to be made in 2 small pieces instead of 1 to save nylon. This became known as a bikini, adopting the name from a small Pacific island where the U.S. tested its World War II high-yield bombs. While some items needed to be rationed because they were needed in war production, other goods were limited because transporting them to the U.S. was dangerous. This included sugar, tropical fruits, coffee, and gasoline. The National Mandatory Rationing Program worked by sending ration books to Americans filled with coupons for certain items. Once you used up your points or coupons, you couldn't buy any more of that item. To gain rationing books, you would register, show ID, and sign up with your local government. Food coupons were color-coded. Only 1 week of the month were items available. To get a gasoline rationing book, you had to submit to home searches to make sure that you had no more than 5 tires per vehicle. Extra tires were seized, and you were limited to 3 gallons of gasoline a week. If your job required more, you had to apply for a special allowance with the U.S. government. While most Americans complied, there was a black market that undermined the conservation of resources. The black market included retailers who would sell rationed items to those without the required coupons, and they would usually charge a higher price to those people. Coupons were supposed to be non-transferable, but a gray market developed where neighbors, friends, family were comfortable trading or giving coupons to each other or even playing poker for them. While the government threw the book at black market retailers, the gray market was allowed to function without disturbance throughout the war. And as every 7th grader in Minnesota has learned, as a patriotic way to add to home food supply with rationing in place, millions of American families began growing vegetables at home in what they called victory gardens. My mom tells a story from 1944 when she was 8 years old, and she and my grandmother, Dorothy, planted a victory garden. My mom, ever since that day, has always maintained a vegetable garden, and she defends it proudly from woodchucks and rabbits with her trusty .22. She's a real patriot. Join me tomorrow, episode 4. We'll look at what happens when the soldiers training in Miami head across the Atlantic to join the war in Europe. Later.